Hey everybody, my name is Dowden, and in this video, we're going to be looking at 5 ways that we can elevate your bass lines. This will help your bass lines sound a little bit more professional, a little bit more exciting, and a little bit more interesting. This video focuses more on staccato bass lines, but you can use the techniques in the video for more sustained bass lines as well. Before we dive into it, I just want to say a special shout out to my patrons. You helped me hit my first goal, which allowed me to slightly upgrade the lighting in the studio, which is going to allow me to bring higher quality videos to my channel. So thank you so much for that. If you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe and let's dive into it. Okay, so we're going to dive in, and I have here this project with 4 different loops. I have this minimal loop, techie prog, house, and techno. And I put 4 different loops in to give a different sense of the way that these bassline tricks will work in each of the different genres, because you know, everybody writes differently, and I just wanted to give a showcase of a few different sounds. So I have this sub here. It's a stock wavetable. And I could use this just as the sub as is. It's clean, it's a sine wave, but I want something with a bit more character. I want something with a bit more harmonic content, and it'll be easier and more interesting for the video. So I'm going to change this into a sawtooth wave and I'm going to turn it into a pluck. I'm going to change this to 24 filter slope, and I'm going to bring the sustain down, the release down as well. What's important about these bass lines is that if we have too much release on the bass line, it'll sound a little bit less choppy when we're doing a staccato bass line like this. But if you're not careful, the bass lines can kind of bleed into each other and bleed into the kick. If the release is too long like this, they fill up that low end, but they're repeating over themselves, and that can cause issues in your mix. So just be careful. You definitely still can do that. Just make sure that you're choosing your release times carefully and your sidechain compressing when necessary. So we have that pluck. We're going to bring the frequency down on the filter, and then we're going to change envelope 2. And with envelope 2, I'm going to bring the sustain down all the way, just like we did with the amplitude envelope. Bring the release down, and decay I'll leave at 600 for now. And this is the important part. We're going to go into the matrix and turn up the amount of envelope 2. So this envelope we just adjusted. We're going to turn that up on the filter frequency 1. But you'll see here it says envelope decay. You don't have the filter. You just click anywhere that you want to adjust. So if I click on resonance here, it'll change it to resonance. If I change frequency, it'll change it to filter 1 frequency. And then I just turn up the amount. So we're just introducing the envelope 2. We're controlling the filter frequency here with envelope 2 by increasing the amount on the matrix here. And I'm going to grab an EQ, and we're just going to throw it on there just to see what it looks like. So we have this nice low end here, and we have all these harmonics. But we still don't have that really low sub. So I'm going to turn on the sub in here, and there we go. Now we have this low sub frequency here. It's down an octave. I'm going to crank up the volume of this. Now that we've made our bass patch, let's dive into the techniques. The first few tips are going to be a little bit easier and more beginner style, where the later tips are going to be a little bit more complex and a little bit more intricate. So it depends where you are on your production skill level, but hopefully they all will appeal to you in some way. So the first technique is using octaves appropriately. So there's a couple different things that we're going to talk about here. I'm going to try and keep it quick, but essentially using octaves in your bass line can just spice things up really easily. So we have right here, we have our loop. It's just really basic. But what if we took this note here and changed the octave of it? Especially with a sawtooth bass with a lot of harmonic content, you're going to hear quite a difference in the sound. So now it's a little bit groovier. We've added a bit of, not necessarily intensity, but we've added a bit of variation and interest to the sound. Try it on the higher octave. Very, very simple, and it adds value. And the next thing that we could actually do is try it on one more here. So we'll bring this one, let's duplicate that and bring it down an octave. And there we go. It's super, super simple, but it's elevated that just a little bit. The second part of the octaves that I'm going to talk about is actually going to bring us into our second technique. So number 2 is going to be layering the bass lines. And again, there's a couple ways that we can do this and a couple ways that we're going to go about this. We have our pattern here. And the first thing that we could do is add a second oscillator as a second layer. So we can go ahead and turn that on, and let's add maybe a square wave. We'll turn down the volume a little bit. And let's hear how it sounds. Super, super basic, but then we could actually go up an octave. So the bass line sounds a little bit more rich, a little bit more interesting, but I'm just going to take that off and I'm going to actually duplicate this entire sound. And now we have a bit more control over it, and we can change the octave in the piano roll. So let's go up an octave. And then with our second layer, that's when we can control the higher and lower octaves as well. So I'm going to get rid of that second layer because I find it a little bit too high end for me for what I'm trying to achieve in these type of tracks. But the lesson is there, the ideas are there. So we have the layering of the octaves, we have the layering of the actual sounds, and we have layering of the oscillators. Just grabbing different oscillators and throwing them in there and just adding a little bit more depth to that bass line. Pretty simple stuff, but often overlooked. So our third technique is going to be adding delay, and dare I say it, a little bit of reverb onto our bass line. I know, no reverb on bass lines. A lot of people, pretty much everybody, when you're learning, or even more advanced producers will tell you, never ever put reverb on your bass line. But there is a couple reasons or ways and techniques that you can do this. Honestly, you have to be very careful with this, but I will show you how you can add just a little sprink on top of your bass lines, and it can add a lot of depth and value, especially for more melodic genres. So I'm going to duplicate the channel. I'm going to add all the effects to that second channel so that we make sure that we have a totally dry signal and then a wet signal on top of that. And this just ensures that you have that dry signal coming through the most that it can without being affected by those wet signals, sort of like a send and return situation. So I'm going to go in here. I'm going to group this by pressing Command or Control G, and it's going to put it into an instrument rack. I open up my chains, wavetable here. I'm going to rename this to dry, and I'm going to duplicate that and rename this one to moist. No, I'm going to rename it to wet. And then I'm going to grab a delay. Grabbing the wrong one. Delay and reverb. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to also duplicate an EQ onto that second channel there. So that'll come in handy a little bit later. But I'm going to, with the wet signal, I'm going to add a delay first and then the reverb. So turn the reverb off. And with the delay, this is very important. I don't want to add delay to the low end. I really don't. It's going to really muddy things up really quickly. I can show you what it sounds like. It's going to sound pretty awful. It's destroying the mix. It's clipping. It's just adding way too much weight. But I want only the wet signal to come through. I don't want the bass to be duplicated here and having both signals coming through with the dry. I want just the wet. So I'm going to turn the delay all the way up to 100% wet. And now all that's coming through is the delayed signal. But we're still going to have that low end. So I'm going to actually filter out by reducing this here. And you can see that it's going up right around here. It's a little higher. And you can see here, I'm still getting a little bit of low end. Sounds pretty cool. Almost trancey, old school. But I don't want that low end in this signal. I want to take that out. So it sounds pretty cool. Now we're going to add the reverb. So reverb is added, and I'm going to put this low cut. I don't want the low end. Bring that up quite a bit. And the thing And the reason you don't want to use reverb on your bass sounds is because it can make it into, and it probably will make it into, a stereo signal. And when you condense a stereo signal into mono, it can cause phase cancellation, especially in the low end. So what I'm going to do is remove any side information with the mid-side EQ inside of Ableton. So I'm going to have the reverb. I'm going to put it just a touch of reverb, very, very slight. You have to be very careful with this. I will reiterate. And I'm going to go in from stereo here to mid-side. And this is only affecting the wet signal because I have it in the wet channel. And when I go to this, now I have the mid here is blue and the side is this orangish yellow that Ableton likes to confuse me with the color palette of. And I'm going to make sure that I remove the side information by dragging this filter, multiply it by 4 and bringing that sucker right up. I don't really want any stereo information here, maybe a tiny, tiny bit in the high end. The mid has most, if not all. The side, I can't even really see any side information here. If I back this off a bit, you'll see that some's getting through. I really have to boost that, which is a good thing because I don't want that stereo information inside my channel because it's a bass. So I'm going to just grab this and I'm just getting rid of all of it just to really make sure. And if I put a utility on here and change it to mono, we should not hear any difference. Even when I'm pushing that width to 400%, which multiplies and increases the actual stereo image, it makes it sound much, much louder, or it amplifies the stereo image. So we would be hearing, if there was a stereo image, we'd be hearing it much louder and there's no change. Which means we have no stereo signal coming through this channel, even with the delay and reverb on it. And therefore, we're not going to downmix to mono and have phase cancellation, which is really the main reason why you don't put reverb on bass, aside from muddiness, which is another thing that you have to be careful of when adding reverb to your bass. But when you do add reverb to your bass, it can help the sound sound a little bit fuller, a little bit more blended and less choppy. And it's really good for, you know, like re-spaces and bass lines that are melodic and have a lot of weight to them. And sometimes you can even add a little touch of stereo width to it if you're very careful. The last thing I'm going to show you is actually another more advanced technique where I'm going to take the wet signal and drop it into its own track here. And I'm going to duplicate the sub pattern. And on this channel, I'm actually going to sidechain compress from the original. So I'm going to grab a compressor, throw that on the end of the channel, sidechain from, and I'm going to do the bass. And I'm just going to really, really compress that. So now when the original bass hits, it's going to turn down the volume or compress the volume using the sidechain compression. So now we have that bass really, really punching through, and we're not having really any frequencies from the secondary bass interfering with it. And that's just going to allow us to create a bit more room in the mix for the sub to come through without being affected by the delay or the reverb of the wet channel. Number 4 is going to be using LFOs, or low frequency oscillators. Essentially, LFOs are just really slow moving oscillators that allow you to control parameters with them. And if you add just a little touch of an LFO to certain parameters on your bass lines, you can make them a bit more interesting, a little bit more humanized, and a little bit more ear candy, a little snack for the eardrums. So I'm going to open up the patch again. I'm just going to grab the dry channel, and I'm going to go back into the matrix here. And different synths will have this in various ways, but essentially just look for the LFO, and you're going to put the LFO to control a parameter inside whatever VST or hardware you have. Okay, so I'm going to turn the rate down a little bit so it's a little bit slower, and then I'm going to turn this retrigger off. So the retrigger is every time the note hits, it's going to essentially restart that LFO, and with it on, we're not going to hear it as much because the sound is so quick. So I'm going to turn the retrigger off, and LFO1, the amount is fine for now. Let's go into the matrix, and I'm going to turn up the LFO1, and we'll put it on the pitch so you can really hear what's going on. It's going to go all the way up, and it's going to go up 48 semitones. I can speed it up a little bit, and then it's going to go back down. So you can obviously hear what's happening. It's following the path of this LFO. So if I were to slow that down to up there maybe, and put that on something that's not so disastrous like the pitch, put that on the filter 1 frequency just a little bit. And you can actually watch here this little orange, yellow, whatever color that is bar. That's what the LFO is doing, but on a, you know, up and down, but it's showing you in the matrix left and right. But you can hear how it's, you know, it's bringing up and down that cutoff, and we can go a little bit less. And if you want to get really crazy, maybe do a second LFO where, you know, the second LFO is controlling LFO1's speed or rate. Oops. And we'll turn that retrigger off as well. And we'll turn this down. And it's very subtle, but it's adding just a little bit of extra flavor to that bass line. It's making it a little bit more intricate to the listener because it's just slightly changing. And if you wanted to add, you know, multiple LFOs, there's actually an LFO tool that you can get with Max for Live, and you can drag and drop that in and map it as well. So really quickly, click on that map, and let's map that to the resonance. And you can see it's actually changing it in real time, which is super cool. And then turn down the depth. Turn down the rate a little bit, and let's turn this 100% down. There we go. And let's turn the depth down a little bit, and the rate down a little bit. Cool, so now we have 3 things that are actually adjusting this bass sound. And that's going to make your bass sound more interesting and more unique as it's playing through the track. It'll get a little bit less repetitive because it's going to be a little bit random now. Let's try it with the different loops here. We'll put our wet back on. You know, you want to make it like really acidy sounding. You can really crank that resonance up. Right, and it's just adding that extra value to the sound. It's making it more interesting. The last technique that I have for you at number 5 is using other sounds as bass sounds, or layering them using the tip number 2 as a layer to your bass sound. And you can do this with tons of different things. You can do this with obviously other synths, or you can do this with percussive elements like your toms. You can do this with, you know, bongos and congas and different instruments that have a decent amount of low end to bring the bass frequencies, or you can use just some high end to kind of complement the top end of the bass and kind of help it shine through the mix. So let's go ahead and try an example. So I'm going to grab, let's grab a tom here. Let's grab a tom here, and you, most of the time, you want to be grabbing a tom that has a pretty strong tone to it. That's very, a very clean sounding tom. If you have a distorted sounding tom or a distorted sounding low end of that sound, it can be a little bit off key or out of tune, and it can be hard to manage. So this is a little distorted. Oh, it's a little distorted in the high end. That one's pretty clean, but I'm looking for something a bit cleaner. Perfect. These are both pretty good. I'm going to grab this one, and I'm going to just duplicate this MIDI information. And I'm going to grab drum rack, drag and drop that on. And then I'm going to grab that tom again. It was 91 and drag it in there. We're looking at, grab all this, rename this to tom, change this to, boop, doop, boop, boop, doop. Oh my goodness. There we go. Color coordinate that. And now we have this layer. Doesn't sound great, but what we can do is, first I'll turn off the wet so we're not dealing with the delay. I'm going to find the key of this. I'm going to get rid of that LFO because I don't need that. I'm going to get rid of the utility because I don't need that. And I'll keep the EQ. I'm going to use the tuner first. Sometimes the tuner doesn't work. Drag and drop that on. You can see it's kind of all over the place between E and F. So I'm going to just solo it and look at the EQ. And it looks to me like it's at E because I see that it's peaking really strong there. But my track is in C, so I'm going to actually go into the controls here. I'm going to bring this transposition down. So we're at E, so I'm going to bring this down. D sharp, D, C sharp, C. And sometimes when you down pitch them like this, they aren't exactly 100% accurate. You have to go in and change it a little bit more. You can see that it's kind of hitting around here. I'm going to bring it down a little bit more. Or maybe up a little more. That looks pretty good to me. So I've brought it down 5 semitones and then went up almost another half semitone back up. And let's listen to that. Let's go down a full octave as well. We'll just go grab that and go down another whole 12 semitones. Now we have this really interesting sounding bass with this really high ringing up here that I'm going to get rid of. That's a pretty powerful sounding bass. Let's hear it with the different sounds here, different loops. Turn it down quite a bit. So much energy behind it. Very aggressive sounding, and even though it's such a clean sounding bass, it has so much punch and power to it. So I'm going to go back up this octave. I'm going to go up even, I could even go one more octave, hear how it sounds. Right? And then you can actually just add that to your bass line. Maybe we just want to use the very, very top end of this sound. It doesn't even have to be, you know, very, very much to add to the bass. Just maybe we just want this top. Just listen to this by itself. Right, we can add that as well. And maybe we don't want that high end so much of this bass. We want it to be more of a sine wave with this top end. Right? Just adding that extra layer of, you know, a layer on top of that that's going to change it from just being a simple bass line to something that's a bit more interesting. This can be super subtle as well, right? Just something to help punch to the bass line. Punch the bass, just something to help the bass line punch through. Let's go back. So let's use everything we've learned to listen to this final bass loop. We'll bring this down an octave. We have 2 layers here with the delay. The LFOs are working. We have the octaves, the layers, the LFO, the delay, and now we have this other percussive element that is being used as sort of a layer to that bass line. And let's grab all these together, and I'm going to, you know, just bass. I'm going to compress them a little bit together. And let's listen to all the different loops now. And there you go. Those are 5 techniques that you can use to elevate your bass lines. I really hope you learned something, and I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, make sure to give me a thumbs up by clicking that like button and subscribe to the channel for more content like this one. Also, check the description for some free checklists, sample pack, and some other goodies as well. Oh, and if you're wondering why I have this little cut on my forehead, walked into a pole the other day. Subscribe.